the Appalachian Mountains have always held a special place in American culture and folklore. It's a place of contradiction, both beautiful and harsh, where it hides old ways, old wounds, and old faiths. That's because if you go where the self-service fails and the kudzu climbs, you'll find churches that test faith against fangs, where belief is proven by taking up venomous snakes, and it was all started by a man named George Hensley. Welcome to Zooaholics, and today we'll be diving into the bizarre history of the Appalachian snake handling cult, a sect of Pentecostal Christianity that didn't just take the Bible literally, it took it lethally. Now before we begin, I just want to point out that this is probably a story that many of you are already a little bit familiar with, since so many mainstream media outlets and YouTube content creators have covered this. But the exact origin and practices of the sect aren't something that I hear a lot of people talking about, and it's not something that I learned until I researched it myself, and so I've decided to share it with all of you. I became more interested in this story after reading about snakebite fatalities here in the US. And after reading through about 200 snake fatality reports over the last 150 years or so, I found that 50 of them had been from religious ceremonies. So about 25% of the bites I read about across the entire country came from this practice, which obviously caught my attention. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as we talk about the bizarre origin of a practice that attempted to test faith, but ultimately tested God. Now, snakes have a broad history of symbolism throughout many cultures in human history. In Christianity, Adam and Eve being deceived by the serpent is probably one of the more famous ones. But it doesn't stop there. In fact, in many Hindu cultures, cobras and other snakes are related to deities like Lord Shiva and Vishnu. And many Native American tribes, like the Hopi, viewed snakes as a sign of rebirth or wisdom. Despite all of the snake symbolism throughout history, there was never really a religious ceremony involving snakes that ever caught on, and there was probably a good reason for that. But all of that would change when George Hensley was born May 2nd, 1881, in Scott County, Virginia. Little is known about Hensley's early life, but what we do know is that his family, including his 12 other siblings, moved around Virginia quite a bit looking for work, and that they were raised strictly Baptist. This was definitely not a bizarre family structure at the time, and Baptist churches were the norm in this part of Virginia. Him and presumably many of his siblings actually spent most of their time working in coal mines, as in the 1890s it was a pretty common practice to just send your kids off to the mines. It wasn't until the 1890s that George Hensley's faith would be shaken, as right outside of his coal mining camp, he witnessed a Pentecostal woman handling a snake during a revival service. He saw this as a showcase of a tremendous amount of faith, and it moved him in a way that nothing else had before, which ultimately, in 1901, led him to renounce the Baptist Church. Around this time, he married his first wife, Amanda Winiger, and moved to Altoona, Tennessee, where he mostly made a living by mining, milling wood, as well as distilling moonshine, something that he would get in trouble for and struggle with for pretty much his entire life. During this time, he attended the Holiness Pentecostal Church of God and was continuously vexed, hoping to live a more righteous life. I guess, except for the living in drunkenness, but One day, Hensley was studying in the book of Mark, specifically Mark 16 verses 17 through 18. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes in their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on the sick, and people will get well. And while he was praying, he found a snake. And then he just picked it up and brought it to church with him. He then began to tell the congregation to prove their faith by holding the snake, stating that if they truly were saved, they would not be harmed by it. Now I find this interesting because it's clear that that childhood interaction with that Pentecostal woman really deeply affected Hensley's faith in a way that he still remembers all these years later when he reads in the book of Mark. And while we're not told explicitly what species of snake this is, it's kind of implied that this is some kind of venomous snake, whether it be a rattlesnake or a copperhead. We'll definitely be getting more into snake species later on into this video, but currently it's not specified as to what this animal was. And it's clear that at this part of his life, Hensley was struggling with his faith, he was struggling to find clarity, and this snake was seen as a sign that his salvation is real. Obviously, he was struggling with alcoholism and a lot of other family issues at the time, so this was to him a very important sign from God. Though a lot of sources say that Hensley's ministry began in 1908, there are many sources that indicate that his ministry started sometime earlier, visiting other churches, sharing his proof of salvation through snake handling. And even though we don't have the exacts onto when he started his ministry, the earliest death I could find from one of his services was from 1906 in Bartow, Florida. After which, the town of Bartow banned snake handling outright, and George Hensley. Now, it's important to note that up until this time, George Hensley was not an ordained minister, and he was just visiting these churches, and they were just letting him in. They were just letting him go up on stage, hand people snakes. But from here, he had already gained some momentum, and he was starting to make a reputation for himself within the Pentecostal church as a whole. Now, before we go any further, it's really important to determine what is actually happening at these snake services. So essentially, they would bring in a box of all of these different snakes, and based on the region or the snakes that they could get, it would be different kinds. But they would be 100% venomous species, which is going to be, in the US, it's going to be rattlesnake species, copperheads, and cottonmouths. Now, the two rattlesnakes that they brought in were the most distinct, and they were the most notorious. In fact, Hensley's ministry is mostly correlated with timber rattlesnake bites. However, we do believe that there were some diamondback rattlesnakes. Now, I just so happen to have some props with me here. I do happen to have some rattlesnake skins here. Now, this is going to be the most prominent rattlesnake species that you're going to hear about in this story, is going to be the timber rattlesnake, colloquially in the South known as the canebrake rattlesnake. And you can see it's got a band down the back, some chevrons, medium-sized snake, and occasionally they'll talk about one of these, which is the eastern diamondback rattlesnake. Now, both of these snakes are deadly. These are both ones that were found hitting the road, and I just kind of hold on to the snake skins for educational purposes. But for all intensive purposes, most of the ones we're talking about are going to be the timber rattlesnake. Now, this is typically a very placid snake species. In fact, I find them to be one of the most mild rattlesnake species. However, they have a very nasty venom and will definitely strike when provoked. It's also kind of crunchy. Now, snake behavior can vary across the board, but for the most part, they were actually using wild snakes. Later on in history, they would start using captive bred ones, but at the time, in the early 1900s, they actually had to go out, catch their own snakes, and bring them in for the church service. And another detail of these services that you can see kind of on the tail end of the verse in Mark is that they could drink deadly poisons and not die. This led the services to also including things like drinking lye and strychnine, which were deadly toxins. Now, obviously, if you see that your neighbor is dancing around with rattlesnakes and drinking poison, you're probably not going to be too thrilled about that. And that's what the government was thinking when looking at these churches. But religion is a very hard thing for the government to meddle with, and freedom of belief is not something to be tampered with lightly. So the government began looking at ways to locally ban snake handling and venomous snake keeping rather than come against the religious beliefs themselves. Now, looking back at Hensley, it wasn't until 1915 that he became an ordained minister. This was mostly due to his wife's help, due to him being mostly illiterate and needing a lot of help with interpretation, writing, and speaking. He also received a lot of support from his congregation and immediate family members when it came to writing and publishing some of his works. Now, at the time, it seemed like all was going well for Hensley and his congregation, besides the occasional faithless heathen dropping dead in the middle of a service. But by the 1920s, Hensley's snake ministry was going to take a pretty big hit. Hensley actually resigned from the Church of God, was divorced by his wife Amanda, and was arrested for making moonshine during the Prohibition era. After a very short time of community service, Hensley escaped his sentencing and hid out with his sister in Ohio. It was here that, at the age of 46, he met his next wife, Irene, who was 21 at the time. And they lived in Ohio until the 1930s before moving back to Kentucky, where he continued his ministry. Now, during this time, during the Prohibition era and Hensley going through a lot of familial issues, there was actually a noticeable gap where religious snake bites were not happening nearly as much. There was definitely a correlation between Hensley not being in ministry and snake bites decreasing. The Pentecostal church was leaning away from snake services and away from Hensley as a whole. This could also be attributed not only to the Prohibition era, but also through Hensley going through a sort of spiritual dry spell at the time. It seemed like he was less involved with ministry, and at this time he was much more worried about himself and his trouble with the law. But it's clear to many historians that Hensley just could never settle down. So, after moving back to Kentucky, he continued his ministry to any churches that would let him speak. and spread the practice that he saw as the ultimate showcase of faith. It was by this time that his snake sermons, through his charismatic nature or by the absurdity of the practice, attracted hundreds of people to listen to him speak. And it was during this time that the bodies began to stack. In Norton, Virginia, during one of his sermons, a young man was killed by a timber rattlesnake, sending the entire crowd into chaos and leading Hensley into temporarily fleeing the state. Next, he traveled to the state of Georgia, where thousands of people across the state would be captivated by his unique display of faith. That was until a man was bitten by a rattlesnake, presumably a timber rattlesnake, during one of his services. When interviewed shortly after, Hensley claimed that this man just wasn't ready for this test of faith, but that he would most certainly still be saved. Unfortunately, the man did not survive, and after performing an incredibly quick funeral, Hensley fled the state before anybody got a chance to prosecute him. Now, these are just a couple of instances of this happening. In fact, this would happen almost everywhere Hensley went, and now the government has a really good reason to make snake handling illegal through the ban of venomous snake keeping without a license. Many local communities, towns, counties, and cities had already personally banned Hensley and the practice of venomous snake handling in their regions, but slowly the states as a whole followed suit. Hensley stayed on the run from law enforcement for quite some time, oftentimes bouncing from state to state, living with family members, or being bailed out by his own congregation members. By this time, there had been close to 40 recorded deaths from snake church services. And while Hensley's ministry only made up about half of those deaths, he was most certainly considered by many to be the face of the cultish practice. By the 1940s, many churches had barred the practice altogether due to experiencing or witnessing some of the tragedies. But even still, the birthplace of snake handling, the Appalachian Mountains, held on to the practice heavily. By 1943, right after getting divorced by his second wife Irene, Hensley met one of his disciples, Raymond Hayes, who was an avid believer in the practice of snake handling to showcase faith. They both went on to found the Dolly Pond Church of God, with Signs following in 1945. And I mean, Signs definitely did follow. They just weren't very good. Many members of the congregation were killed or nearly killed by timber rattlesnake bite, with each resulting incidents having one excuse or another as to why they weren't saved from death. This is definitely interesting because you see that faith is kind of the determiner of whether you will survive or even get bit in the first place. But when people do die, there's always a good reason for it. For instance, if that guy died, it's simply because, well, he was going to turn his back on the faith soon, so God took him out with that rattlesnake before he had a chance to become a lost soul. Now see, that guy right there, he died to prove to the rest of the world that we're not just handling like water snakes here. He died to prove to the world that we truly are handling venomous snakes. Thank you, Jim, for your sacrifice. But the number one cause of death within the churches, of course, was faithlessness. It was you didn't have enough faith, and therefore you got bit, and then after that you also still didn't have faith, and so you died. Faith was definitely the cornerstone of this belief that if you hold these animals, you won't be bit. And even if you are bitten, you won't die. And when that doesn't happen, it's because your faith was lacking. Hensley and Hayes would be arrested many times for the practice of snake handling, but each time they were either able to escape or be bailed out. At this point, Hensley's reputation began to precede him, with many churches outright rejecting him, and even a lot of his immediate family members not wanting anything to do with him. Despite all of this, he had convinced many people that this was the ultimate showcase of faith. He even remarried a woman named Inez, but ultimately this marriage would not even last a single year. And it wasn't until 5 years later that he met his last wife, Sally Norman, who became just as dedicated to his ministry and mission as he was. In July of 1955, while preaching down in Alpha, Florida, Hensley was struck by a rattlesnake on the wrist while putting it back into its box. He refused medical attention, attributed the bite to the congregation's lack of faith, and then died the next morning. Also, one of the funniest notes of this story, the county judge, Hannah Gaskin, ruled his death not as a wildlife incident or a snake bite, but as a suicide, which is just, while somewhat accurate, is pretty hilarious. Throughout Hensley's life, he labeled his critics heretics or unbelievers, saying that his continued survival was the evidence of truth, the evidence for his faith. But unfortunately, it's not where our story ends. Over the next 20 years, the rate of snake bites in conjunction with religious ceremonies increased in the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Virginia, and West Virginia. At this time, the practice had been outright banned in all states except for West Virginia, where it's actually still 100% legal to this day, and where many of the snake churches still reside. Many of these churches look at Hensley's life as one of great fate, and believe that many of his criticism, including his arrests, divorces, and extreme alcoholism, were all falsified slander bent on persecuting him and stifling his message of faith. There are far too many stories to cover within the snake handling churches in one video. We'll just take a look at two incidents that were a little bit more recent. In 1992, Glenn Summerford, another serpent handling preacher, was convicted of attempted murder of his wife with a rattlesnake by forcing her to be bitten not once, but twice while at their home. He said his reason for doing this was to build up her faith and her resilience to the venom. However, upon investigation, other motives for murder were in fact found. This is an interesting one to me because if there's ever just somebody in the church that they don't like, they're just like, let's test that one's faith. Here's a rattlesnake. Very interesting. No telling how many times that's actually happened though. Another favorite of mine was in July of 2008. Where state authorities conducted an undercover sting operation called Twice Shy, resulting in the arrest of 10 individuals and the procuring of 125 illegally kept venomous snakes, mostly comprising of timber rattlesnakes and copperheads. I actually didn't talk a lot about copperheads today, but that was another very commonly used snake for these ceremonies. Cottonmouths were occasionally obtained, but being as up in the Appalachian Mountains, there's not a ton of cottonmouths. They mostly ended up with copperheads. I actually do have a copperhead right here. Now they don't normally actually look like this because this one's striped, but like, you get the idea. This is a copperhead, generally speaking. They're not as deadly as things like timber rattlesnakes. There have been deaths from copperheads, but they're a little bit fewer and far between. If you get bit by one of these, you're probably not going to die with medical attention. I don't think there were any copperhead deaths within the snake church, but it was definitely a species that sent a few people to the hospital and did cause frequent bites within the church. Among those arrested was Pastor Gregory James Coots of the Full Gospel Tabernacle in Jesus' Name, found in Middlesboro, Kentucky, where 74 snakes were seized from his home alone. Not only was Coots caught in this scandal, but 9 years later in 2014, Pastor James Coots would die from a bite within the same congregation. In fact, when paramedics arrived, his own relatives refused medical attention for him, saying it was inconsistent with his religious beliefs. And he later that same evening died at home. Today, many of these snake churches actually still exist, mostly within the confines of West Virginia. But they're very secretive, and any of them held outside the state of West Virginia are held illegally. So it's really hard to say just how many of these churches still exist. But many people estimate that there are well over 100 of these churches scattered throughout the Appalachian Mountains. The philosophy of George Hensley ultimately came from this place of desiring a deeper, stronger faith. Whether because of his fear or some kind of deeper level of dedication, I guess we'll never know. But it's important to realize that this practice is very unique to this sect of Christianity. And to me, it's pretty funny because if you look one book over from Mark, you'll find that in Luke 4:11 through 12, there's a story where Satan is tempting Jesus to throw himself off of the temple wall by saying, "Throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you. They will lift you up with their hands so that you may not strike your foot against a stone." Which seems to me like a very similar verse to the one found in Mark. But then Jesus responds by saying, "It is written, do not test the Lord your God." I find it really funny because these two statements are just a simple book apart, and nobody at any point goes, "Hey guys, maybe we should not test God." Regardless of the reasons, playing with venomous snakes often comes with deadly consequences. And I can speak from experience when I say that these animals definitely don't want to be picked up. They mostly just want to be left alone into their rocks, into their burrows. But once again, they are most certainly not an animal to test. If you're looking for any additional readings on the snake churches, the book Salvation on Sand Mountain is a first-hand account of some of the experiences within the snake church and in Appalachian culture. National Geographic also did an excellent documentary on it a few years back. And one of my favorites, it actually has a whole scene in one of Steve Irwin's old rattlesnake documentaries before they head to a rattlesnake den. And they have all the old footage from the 90s. It's really cool. And if you guys would like to see any more videos covering this topic, or if there's anything in this video that I missed that you guys would really like to know more about, please make sure to let me know down in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys next time.